What's up, everybody? I'd like to welcome you all to Blacks in Cinema, the podcast that will explore the history of black actors, producers, and directors in Hollywood. I'm your host, Calvin Saunders, and I'd like to take you on a where we explore the history of African Americans on the big screen. Comedies, dramas, action films, and everything in between.
All I want to know if you got your popcorn ready.
Welcome everyone to Blacks in Cinema. I'm your host Calvin Saunders, and on today's podcast I'd like to talk a little bit about the Blaxploitation era of films. The Blaxploitation era of films saw its heights in the 1970s. Mainly between 1971 and 1976 is when you saw a boom in these movies. There were movies, however, that were made in the 1980s, 1990s, and into the 2000s that fell under this same umbrella. The term Blaxploitation was coined by the NAACP and the Urban League, and in their eyes these films negatively depicted black people in the black community, exploited the black community, and just overall shed a bad light on black people in America. In these films, for the first time in Hollywood, were black actors cast in lead roles, and black directors and black writers and other workers in Hollywood were employed like never before. A lot of these movies were action movies, and never had Hollywood seen a black action hero. Before the Blaxploitation of films, blacks had started to make some way in Hollywood. Actors like Dorothy Dandridge, Harry Belafonte, and Sidney Poitier had been placed in roles in big movies in Hollywood. A lot of these films that they starred in were musicals or dramas, and were not on the same or not in the same genre that you could put in Blaxploitation films. Previously in Hollywood, starting in the early 1900s up and through the 1960s, many black characters played the same 5 character types. You had the mammy, which was the black mother figure, the black servant, who put her personal interests aside and all she cared about was taking care or doing a job or pleasing her boss, her employer, her master, if you will. Then there is the uncle character. The uncle is an older black man who again puts his personal interests aside and is just there, is kind of lazy and doesn't have much place in the film but to take care of someone. Then you have the coon. The coon is seen as the jester, the clown. He's there for entertainment. He's there to sing a song or do a dance, kind of carefree, no responsibilities. He's just there to have a good time, but you can't trust the coon. You have the buck character. The buck is over-sexualized. The buck is aggressive. It's a large, dark-skinned black man, usually with his shirt off for some reason. But that is the buck character that usually plays the villain, and he's there to just kind of cause havoc for everyone. Then you have the tragic mulatto. The tragic mulatto is a fair-skinned black woman who is always in the middle of drama, and she can't take care of any of her problems, and she needs someone to save her. You usually see her at some point in the movie fainting or falling over and usually crying, but she needs someone to save her. So those were the 5 characters that you usually saw in movies, and not just in movies, but in the American society in the early 1900s up through the 50s and 60s. Again, there were musicals like Carmen Jones and other films like A Raisin in the Sun, which is based off of a play where blacks did have different roles, but never like you would see in the Blaxploitation films, which were mainly action film. 2 movies that were seen as kind of jump-starting the Blaxploitation era were both made in 1971. One was Shaft. Shaft was directed by Gordon Parks, a black man, and starred Richard Roundtree, another black man, as Detective John Shaft. And John Shaft was seen as a hero. He was the savior of Harlem. He took care of the black community and solved a lot of cases and kind of protected the community in that sense. The other movie had more of a rebellious theme to it, and that was Melvin Van Peebles' Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song. And Melvin Van Peebles wrote, directed, and was the main star in the film. And this film was mainly directed at getting back at the man. Getting back at the man, or you hear the man a lot in these films and kind of still in the culture today, but a lot in the 70s and 80s. The man was just seen as society or the oppressor. Anyone or anybody or any corporation that kind of wanted to hold the black man or the black community down. So sometimes the man wasn't an actual character or a figure, but it was just seen as society as a whole. And that movie was all about sticking it to the man, as you would hear throughout a lot of these movies. But there were many movies through this time, movies like Black Caesar, Foxy Brown, The Mac, Superfly, Blackula, and the list goes on and on. You saw black actors coming from a lot of different places to star in these films. Ron O'Neal, who was a star in Superfly, was a Broadway actor for many years and came over to act on the big screen. You saw ex-athletes jump from the football field and the gridiron onto the movie scene. Fred Williamson is nicknamed the Hammer. He played in the NFL from 1960 to 1967. He was a defensive back who played with the Oakland Raiders, Kansas City Chiefs, and the Pittsburgh Steelers. Very famously, you had Jim Brown, who was a running back for the Cleveland Browns. At the time that he retired, he was the NFL's all-time leading rusher, and he retired at only 29 years old and went directly to the Hall of Fame. Both of these actors made the jump from sports and athletics to being on the big screen and were cast in lead roles in these action movies. Another aspect of these films that really stood out was the music. Never before had you seen funk and R&B and soul music placed as soundtracks for films. Some of the biggest artists in the world did soundtracks for these movies. Curtis Mayfield famously did the soundtrack for Superfly. James Brown, the godfather of soul, did the soundtrack to Black Caesar. Isaac Hayes created one of the most famous songs in our culture still today, which is the theme from Shaft, and he did the entire soundtrack for Shaft. Now, the conflict comes in because these movies were action movies, but it is how they portrayed black people in them. A lot of these movies glorified gangsters and violence, pimps and prostitution, drug dealing and drug users, and those type of things. And that was the NAACP's problems, is that they didn't want the masses thinking that, oh, the only thing in the black community were these negative images that were being seen. Now, for the first time in Hollywood, like I said, black actors were being cast, black directors were getting their first chance to direct motion pictures, black writers' scripts were being used. So you have an all-black staff who are making these movies for the black community. Now, of course, everyone is seeing them, blacks, whites, and everyone. But if you have an all-black cast for the first time, is that really a bad thing? Some people saw the message and they just didn't agree with it. In my opinion, I think that blaxploitation films were both positive and negative. They were positive because it gave a lot of people an opportunity that they had never gotten before and maybe never would have gotten if it wasn't for these films. And it let people show their talents that they may not have ever gotten the opportunity to. It was negative because we all know how important and how impactful visual imaging can be in a person's psyche. As we know, during the 1960s and 1970s, the United States was dealing with a lot of race relations and the civil rights movement. These images that are being portrayed as blacks being violent or drug abusers or drug dealers may not have been the best thing to show as black people are trying to gain equal rights. But at the same time, black people are being employed. I think that these films were very entertaining and were no different than some of the gangster movies or some of the gangster movies that you would see from the 40s and the 50s. But it's all about the perception of these films. It is easy to say that without these movies being made, that blacks in Hollywood would have never gotten the breakthrough that they got eventually down the road. So whether you agree with the movies or you agree with the NAACP and how they felt, there is no doubt that these movies had a very large impact on Hollywood and the American society overall. Well, that wraps up our time with Blacks in Cinema. I hope everyone enjoyed their experience. I appreciate everyone who took time to listen. Until next time.